Hey there, and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at a very interesting phenomenon, the North Korean Simpsons. If you were to ask any random person on the street who the Simpsons are, they would likely respond with some iteration of the longest running sitcom of all time, which originally aired in the 90s. But what if I told you that this iconic show has been reinterpreted in one of the most isolated countries on Earth? Well, hold on to your Duff beer because it's about to get real Springfield weird. We'll start by examining where these two seemingly disparate things meet: television. While North Korea is commonly known for its leader supreme, foreign policy, and nuclear ambitions, it also has a domestic entertainment industry which heavily mirrors that of South Korea, but with a distinctly communist twist. For instance, the country is home to K-pop, although you probably wouldn't recognize any of the bands. And it has a film industry which turns out patriotic propaganda, as well as low-budget thrillers and comedies. However, despite being largely devoid of foreign media, The Simpsons has made its way to the Hermit Kingdom. When we think about the incredible reach of The Simpsons, we have to wonder just how many people around the world it hasn't reached. With over 700 episodes and 30 seasons, the show has become a mainstay in pop culture history. The crazy part is that when The Simpsons began airing in North Korea, it was actually during the latter half of the 90s. This might sound confusing since the show premiered in the United States in 1989. So how can it had a head start of nearly a decade? It all has to do with censorship. Because of the political climate between the two Koreas, it took years for North Korea to even consider allowing the show to air in the country, and when they finally did, it wasn't without making a few changes. In fact, before we dive into those changes, let me give you a little bit of background on the show itself. As some of you may know, The Simpsons follows the everyday life of a working-class family in the town of Springfield. The show isn't necessarily political, but it does tackle social issues from time to time. When you think of The Simpsons, you probably think of Homer, the bumbling but well-meaning father; Marge, his eternally patient wife; Bart, the mischievous son; Lisa, the intelligent daughter; and Maggie, the baby who only ever sucks her thumb. These 5 characters are at the center of almost every episode and are some of the most recognizable animated figures of our generation. Now, when this show first started airing in North Korea, it didn't take long for locals to warm up to the characters. The appeal of a goofy family getting into wacky situations is pretty universal, even if your version of that family looks slightly different. We don't know exactly why the North Korean government allowed the show to air in the first place. After all, it's not exactly known for supporting Western media. But I suspect that it had something to do with the show's popularity and the fact that it could make the North Koreans look like they were on such a killjoy. However, this honeymoon period didn't last for long. One of the most popular episodes in the US is Last Exit to Springfield, an episode in which the power dynamics of Springfield are turned upside down when the workers at the power plant go on strike. While this plotline doesn't seem particularly controversial, it was enough to raise the ire of North Korea's leadership. You see, one of the biggest taboos in North Korea is anything to do with labor unions. In fact, the right to organize is technically illegal in the country. So naturally, an episode revolving around a group of workers standing up for their rights was deemed unacceptable. Instead, the censors chose to edit out the entire plotline and replaced it with something much less stimulating. In the original version, the workers go on strike after Homer accidentally breaks the plant's medical insurance. In retaliation, Mr. Burns cuts off their healthcare benefits, causing Homer to team up with the union leader, Slick Winnie, to fight back. The problem is that the word union is heavily suppressed in North Korea, so they couldn't really use that storyline. Instead, they opted to completely remove the workers' grievances and instead focused on Mr. Burns trying to seduce Principal Skinner's mother. That's right. The censors literally removed the entire B plot from the episode and replaced it with a thinly veiled subplot from the A plot. Needless to say, this kind of censorship was fairly common for the series in the country. But no matter how much they edited the show, there was still one thing that North Korean audiences couldn't wrap their heads around: capitalism. While the American audience is quick to pick up on the satirical jabs at consumerism and free market economies, the North Korean audience didn't quite get the joke. To make matters worse, the irony was lost on them because their own society is essentially a caricature of communism. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand the differences between these two economic systems, but it doesn't hurt. For example, capitalism is characterized by private ownership of the means of production, while communism is characterized by common or state ownership. Another key difference is that capitalism is based on free market principles, while communism is based on central planning. In a capitalist economy, prices are determined by supply and demand, while in a communist economy, prices are set by the government. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that this isn't exactly how things work in North Korea, which begs the question, why is it even in the Hermit Kingdom? Well, for starters, North Korea isn't technically a communist state. Even though it styles itself after the Soviet Union, it's more accurate to describe it as a totalitarian dictatorship. In fact, despite the country's official ideology being a variant of communism called Chucky, the government operates much more like a cult. Chucky is characterized by three key principles: self-reliance, independence, and unity. Each of these principles is designed to foster a sense of national identity and pride among North Koreans. But when you think about it, these principles aren't exactly conducive to economic growth. That's why North Korea is often referred to as a command economy. Unlike a capitalist or a free market economy, the government controls all aspects of the economy, from the price of goods and services to the distribution of resources. Now, this might sound like a good idea in theory, but in practice it leads to a lot of inefficiencies. For example, because of the government's tight control over the economy, North Korea is unable to compete with other countries in the global marketplace. This lack of competition has led to a decline in the quality of goods and services in the country. Additionally, because of the government's focus on heavy industry, light industry such as manufacturing consumer goods has been neglected. As a result, North Koreans have little access to modern conveniences such as televisions, refrigerators, and washing machines. Another major difference between North Korea and traditional communist states is the role of foreign investment. While communist states are typically wary of foreign investment, North Korea has actively courted it in recent years. This is likely because the government realizes that it cannot continue to rely on heavy industry and military spending to drive economic growth. Instead, it needs to attract foreign investment in order to develop the service and technology sectors. Despite these efforts, however, North Korea remains one of the poorest countries in the world. The average North Korean earns less than $2,000 per year, and over 20% of the population lives in extreme poverty. This brings us back to The Simpsons. When the writers of The Simpsons wrote episodes that satirized capitalism and consumerism, the North Korean audience didn't get the joke. They simply saw a bunch of people flaunting their wealth and living a lifestyle that they could only dream of. Of course, this wasn't the intended effect, but it's understandable given the vast economic disparity between the two countries. For example, in one episode, The Simpsons go on a camping trip, and Homer buys a brand new RV. The North Korean censors were quick to edit out this scene because it depicted a level of wealth that is simply unattainable for most North Koreans. And that's not to say that North Koreans don't work hard. They simply don't have access to the same opportunities as people in free market economies. The same goes for another iconic Simpsons product, the nuclear power plant. In the United States, nuclear power is a hotly debated topic. But in North Korea, it's simply seen as a symbol of American imperialism and capitalism. Therefore, any references to nuclear power had to be edited out of the show. It might seem silly to edit out references to nuclear power when the country is known for its nuclear weapons program, but this was simply the best way to avoid drawing attention to the show. It's not uncommon for North Koreans to watch The Simpsons without sound, so they wouldn't even hear any dialogue that could cause trouble. But the visuals were still a potential source of controversy. For example, in one episode, The Simpsons traveled to Washington, D.C. and visit the White House. This was obviously a sensitive subject for the North Koreans, so the censors went to great lengths to obscure the building's name. In the end, they simply blurred out the word white and left house clearly visible. This created a strange visual effect that was sure to raise suspicion among viewers. But it was a risk the censors were willing to take. The main goal was to prevent any association between The Simpsons and the American government. Strangely enough, this was one of the only times that the censors made an effort to obscure a building's name. In other scenes, they simply chose to ignore the presence of American landmarks. For example, in one scene, the Simpsons are walking down the street and pass by a Starbucks. The censors didn't bother to cover up the logo, perhaps because they assumed that North Koreans wouldn't recognize it anyway. The Simpsons has been airing in North Korea for over 20 years now, and it's safe to say that the censors have gotten pretty lazy over time. Nowadays, they don't even bother to change the dialogue. Instead, they just let the actors speak freely and hope for the best. Whether or not this strategy will continue remains to be seen. But for now, it's the best way to keep The Simpsons from becoming too controversial. So what do you think? Was it weird seeing The Simpsons through the lens of North Korean censorship? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.